Hi, I'm Michael Roderick, and you're listening to A Shark's Perspective.
Welcome back and thank you for joining A Shark's Perspective. I am Kenneth Kenny, but friends call me Shark. I'm a keynote speaker, strategist, a shark diver, host of this show, and your chief shark officer. Is your business referable? For many business people, it's a dream. When you want people talking about your brand in a positive way. But are they equipped to speak clearly about you? Will that story continue in simple terms so that it can be recited from one person to another in a structure that helps make that message stick? I will ask again then in a slightly different way. How do you make your product or service referable? Michael Roderick is a former high school English teacher and former Broadway producer who is now the CEO of Small Pond Enterprises, which helps thoughtful givers become thought leaders by making their brands referable, their messaging memorable, and their ideas unforgettable. And on this episode, we'll discuss becoming referable, the AIM framework, the LESS method, buying on emotion, differentiation, stickiness, target problems and wicked witches, sharing TED Talks, a check for understanding, Shakespeare and Marlowe, how slime is made, grocery shopping in Harlem, raising money on Broadway, and a lot more. So let's tune into a referable Michael with a referable shark on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. Michael, welcome to A Shark's Perspective. Tell us a little bit about your background and your story. It is an interesting one.
Thanks. Yeah, so I started out as a high school English teacher, and I went from being a high school English teacher to becoming a Broadway producer in under 2 years. So a lot of people were very curious about that and wanted me to sort of pull back the curtain on that process. So I started to study networking. I
But
started to
what were you
actually
teaching in high school?
so I was teaching English, and I ran the drama program at the school as well.
Okay, so that was a little bit of the tie-in. I guess I was trying to tie back to
Yeah.
Broadway producer. But those jobs just don't fall
Yeah.
out of trees. How did you get that job?
No. So what I learned was that the world of Broadway is really about raising money. And raising money is all about building relationships. And one of the biggest elements of Broadway is the idea that when somebody wants to be a Broadway producer, they go to another Broadway producer and they say, I'll raise this money if I can get credit on the show. Right. So they'll say, I can raise this much for you. And then my name gets above the title or gets, promoted in some, in some capacity. So I saw that and I went to a bunch of producers and I said, I actually don't want credit. I just want to get better at raising money. So if you're willing to give me paperwork, I can't promise anything, but I'm going to go out there and I'm going to see if I can find money for you. And as a result, I had all of these producers give me their paperwork. So the interesting thing about that was when I went to an investor, whereas most of my colleagues were coming to an investor with one show and basically being like, do you want to invest in this or not? I was actually coming to these people with a portfolio. So I ended up raising a lot of money for a lot more projects because I didn't ask for the credit. And what eventually happened was people kind of got word that I was doing this, and some producer came to me and basically offered me credit to raise money on a project called the Scottsboro Boys. So I did that, and I got my first Broadway credit that way.
And then you transition to what you do now.
Yes.
So how
Yep.
did you decide to
Yeah.
make that pivot? These
Yeah.
are hard
So
lefts.
yes, I mean there's a lot of them. So basically, I after all of that experience, everybody wanted to know like how I was getting into all the doors I was getting into, and my initial impression was that it was networking. Right, that it was just about the fact that I was good at relationship building. So I was like, oh, okay, I'll teach people frameworks and models and sort of ways to think about relationship building. And I had kind of built a whole brand around that process. I had run a conference for connectors for a number of years. I had been featured in these books about super connectors. But there was this period where I basically just asked myself, if I took networking out of the equation, what was it that got me into all the rooms I got into? And I had this realization that it was because people would talk about me and my ideas when I wasn't in the room in a way. So I started to look at, because I had built all of these relationship building frameworks, I started to ask myself, could I build frameworks around referability? Could I actually break down why it is we talk to others about somebody else's ideas, why we refer back to people, why we sort of share these concepts? And I just started kind of testing a lot of these theories with people who were in that subject matter space. So now that's the work that I do, is I help thoughtful givers become thought leaders. So people who are very good at doing the work for their clients are usually the ones who struggle with packaging their intellectual property. So I bring all of these referability elements into it and help them start to get these larger ideas out there.
Where did Small Pond Enterprises come from? The name.
Yeah. So I'm originally from Rhode Island, and everybody knows everybody in Rhode Island. So when I decided that I was going to move to New York, all of my friends said, "Here, you're a big fish in a small pond. You go to New York, and nobody's going to know you." And I decided that I told them I'm going to go to New York and create my own small pond, and that's what I did. I basically brought a lot of people together. I started running all these shows, doing all these different types of things. So when I started to think about, well, what would I call the company, I decided to call it Small Pond Enterprises.
A great name.
Thank you.
So how do we make our product or service, make our package referable? Talk a little bit about that methodology.
Yeah. So the way to think about it is, and it's easy to remember because it spells the word aim. So you want to think about the idea of taking aim, and that's accessibility, influence, and memory. So your first hurdle is always accessibility, because most of the time, if you are a subject matter expert, you are overwhelmed by your own expertise. And very, very often, you live in what I like to refer to as the echo chamber of the enlightened, where everybody in your industry is kind of using the same language, and you're using that language thinking, oh, well, this is how everybody talks. But the second you go outside of that industry, people start looking at you like, I don't know what you're talking about. Right. And the big challenge that happens is that we almost always think in the context of like, how do I present to you what I'm all about versus how do I present to you what I can actually do for you? And there's a very, very big difference between those two things. I can share with you expertise and tell you about my background and all those different types of things, but you don't necessarily care about that. But if I'm able to identify and really actually give language to your problem, the thing that you are struggling with, then what's going to happen is you're going to be leaning in and saying, oh my God, you get me, you understand me, and you're going to be very open to hearing about the solution that I have or the way that you can think about this. So that's always the first hurdle, is accessibility, and really thinking through, how am I making sure that whatever it is I'm sharing, whatever it is that I'm offering, is so clear that people outside of my industry can get it. Next is influence. And most of us think about influence in the context of persuasion because that's what we've always read and sort of been taught, right? So we always hear about influence in the context of, I'm going to do these things to get you to do something. But true influence is when you do something without me asking you to do it. If you do something for me and I haven't asked you and I haven't coerced you in any way, that is true influence. And the only reason you're going to do that is because it gives you something. It makes you look good. So most of the time, what we're trying to do when we think about influence is we're thinking, how do I package this so that I look cool, so that I look interesting? And what we want to do is we want to package our ideas and our concepts so that when other people share them, they look cool. They look interesting. And the easiest metaphor that I like to use for this is the idea of a magic trick. And if you've ever gone and you've seen a magician, they will show you all these different tricks, but then they usually have at least one trick where they'll show you exactly how they do the trick. And what's the next thing that you want to do? You basically say, oh, I just learned how to make the card disappear behind my hand. So if you're at a party, you do that, right? And when we craft our ideas and our concepts in such a way that when other people share them, they look good, that's when we truly have influence. That's when we're really making it so that people want to go out and talk about our ideas because our ideas are making them look better. Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. I just think you're going to have a hard time trying to destroy the minds of everybody for the last 20 years who've been on social media, who've made it me, 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 look at me. So it sounds like every
Exactly.
Instagram post I've ever seen.
Exactly. So, and this is the thing, right? We've sort of been, I call it the Faustian bargain of the personal brand, right? We've been sold the idea that the way to become famous, the way to be known, is to basically be this celebrity where it's like it's all about me because we see that within different cultures and different the whole social media world and everything else. But when people are sharing something, they are getting something out of sharing it. And there are very few of us who want to basically put our entire lives on display in the hopes that we're going to get a following. So I think it's actually much, much better to speak softly and carry a big idea. Because if you've got a well positioned idea, if you've got a really interesting framework or a model or a way of thinking, people will go out and share that model with others because it makes them look cool. It makes them look interesting, right? And that's at the heart of this idea of influence. So the last piece is memory. And the way that I like to think about memory is if you want people to remember you more, you focus on less. And that is language, emotion, simplicity, and structure. So I'll start with language. The reason why we all know who Shakespeare is, and only English majors know who Christopher Marlowe is the fact that Shakespeare added new words to the English language. And anytime there is a new word or a new way of saying things, it basically carves a piece of real estate in our brains. And I can basically use language right now, and you will instantly refer it to a certain brand. So if I say venti coffee, you instantly think of Starbucks,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Sure.
It's just a natural thing. If I say use the force and you have watched a lot of movies, then you think of Star Wars, right? Like it's those types of things. So the thing that often happens is that we very rarely create our own language for things or come up with our own ways of saying things because the other way is considered safe to a lot of people. If I already know a word is popular and I'm seeing everybody using that word, it's very natural for me to think, okay, well, I'll just use that word too. And this is what ends up happening. People just sort of start using these, I call them container words, right? Where we all hear them and we kind of nod, but we don't necessarily know what they mean. And we all have different definitions of it. And the way that I like to think about it is you want to open up that container and you want to find the contents. You want to ask yourself, if I couldn't use this word that everybody else is using, which word would I use? And how does that word tie to like who I am and what I believe and what I see? Right. So if we have our own language, what'll happen is we will basically carve a piece of real estate in people's brains. They will start thinking of us in that way. They'll start thinking of us in the context of the ideas that we're spreading. So the second is emotion, and emotion solidifies memory. And the easiest way to illustrate this is if I asked you what you were up to 3 days ago and I asked you to give me a lot of detail, there's a good chance that some things would be fuzzy. You'd kind of look back at the day and be like, I'm not quite sure. But if I said to you, imagine right now what you would consider the saddest day of your life and tell me the details of that day, you're going to remember far more details because your brain is like a sponge when you are in a heightened state of emotion. And again, we don't do this very often, right? We don't take the time to tap into emotion, especially when we're talking about our ideas, our concepts, because we're again sort of in that echo chamber of the enlightened, right? We're kind of living in that world of, okay, well, I'm going to teach you something, I'm going to present something to you, and we don't take a moment to say, well, what are the emotional components of this experience? How did this feel? And help others to feel that. And when we do that, they become more connected to us and they remember the material. And this is why, for many of us, we remember very, very specific scenes in movies because we were in a very heightened state of emotion. And it doesn't have to be sadness, it can be laughter, right? We all know a film that we can tell you the scene where we laughed so hard that we couldn't stop laughing, right? Because our memory pulls that in. So we always want to think about, how do I insert emotion into this experience? And the next thing is simplicity. And all throughout pretty much all of academics, we have been rewarded for complexity. From the earliest days of school, the more complex, the smarter you were. So if you wrote a big paper, you were smart. If you used big words, you were smart. You were always seen as being above if you had complexity to what you were doing, right? But when we get out into the real world, complexity drives people nuts because the memory rewards simplicity. The simpler something is, the easier it is for us to carry in our memory. And the example that I often like to use about this is the grocery store. So if I said, go to the grocery store, get me milk, eggs, and cheese, you're not going to forget that grocery list. But if I said, go to the grocery store, get me milk, eggs, cheese, some cleaner, candy bar, a half roasted chicken, and some sponges, there's a good chance I'm not going to get my groceries, right? Because your brain is kind of trying to hold on to all of those things. And this is the mistake that I see so many subject matter experts make, is that they try to impress people with their complexity, right? So they try to say, like, here's my 32 points of leadership that you need to think about. And who is going to remember 32 points, right? Who's going to think in that way? You're not going to share that. You're not going to pass that on. And we always want to have something that we make it really simple for people to be able to pass on, going back to the influence concept, right? And that ties to the last piece, which is structure, because our brains need order in order to process information. So the more that we give people a structure, the more likely it is that they're going to share that information. This is why jokes have been around as long as they have, because they have a structure that never changes, a setup and a punchline, right? So anytime we're thinking about how does somebody share this idea, we have to ask ourselves, do they have a structure to be able to share it? So anybody listening to this has a structure to be able to share the 3 points of referability, because it spells the word aim and it's accessibility, influence, and memory. I've given you a structure to carry the information. And that's what you always want to think about. If you're trying to make sure that somebody's able to remember something, you want to make sure that they have a structure to carry that information when you want them to be able to share it. And, I could go miles deep into each of those particular concepts. We could spend a ton of time, digging into any element of accessibility, influence, and memory, or even just less. But that is, if you wanted to sort of look at it from like a 30,000-foot view, that is at the core of the elements of referability.
Well, I won't be the English historian, you will be, but a couple of points here. One is Marlowe kind of cleared the field early and died before Shakespeare. So it gave Shakespeare a little more room to also dominate the scene once Marlowe bit it in a I think it was a bar fight or something.
Yeah, I think
But
so. I think you're right.
yeah, I think he was a little bit of a drunkard back in the 1500s. But no, I agree with your point on Shakespeare's language. One of the things, though, that I discuss a lot of times with people, and I'd love you to elaborate, you use the example of going into a grocery store. And a lot of
Mhm.
times, as much as we want to impact emotion into that
Mhm.
argument, and I get it and agree with it, but not everything is necessarily triggered by emotion. A lot of things are not.
Yeah.
How do you use the AIM method to really stick with people when they're making normal purchases? It could be something at the grocery store or a product and service that's normal with a problem that needs to be solved versus one that really has an emotional context to it.
Sure. So everything, I would argue that everything actually does have an emotional context to it, and that emotional context comes from the basically the meaning that you give that particular experience. So for somebody who is on a diet and has really been struggling with their weight and had a lot of issues, a purchase of the cookies that are breaking that diet is actually a very emotional purchase, right? So the thing is, there are ways that a lot of these things are described that we may not necessarily see it as like, oh, super intense emotion, but they're tapping into our emotions whenever they're selling to us,
No, I agree
right?
completely.
Yeah. So the thing is, even if you have something that you think, and I think that, so this actually reminds me of, I went, my daughter Juniper um, wanted to go to this slime museum, and basically the idea was you went and you made slime. And when I went there, what I discovered was that slime is mostly made as a result of using Elmer's glue, which is probably one of the most boring like items in the world. But think about how sort of exciting and interesting slime is, right?
Oh, I want to go.
So yeah, right. It's like amazing, right? You
Yeah.
think about it in that way. But the thing is that glue is like the product or the idea. We think there's absolutely no way that I could infuse emotion into this, or et cetera, because that's our natural way of thinking about it. But how could we turn that glue, how could we turn that thing that is boring into slime, right? So how could we start to explore the idea of emotion, especially when our competitors may not be, right? So if you're selling a product or a service and that service does not have any sort of emotion to it normally, how can you infuse that? And I mean, Apple is a perfect example of that, because in the beginning, we looked at these technology elements, we looked at these tools, these computers, these chips, like all these things as very non-emotional, right? Like it's technology, it's not emotional at all. And then Steve Jobs comes along and gives this intense emotional speech about the launch of a product, and all of a sudden everybody's treating Apple like it's a religion, right? And this is the thing. We can look at anything that we're doing and we can start to ask, well, is there an emotional component to this? And we're going to find that there is. We're going to find that there's something that we can tap into that gets people to start to think about this particular idea, this particular concept, this product, or this service. It's just a matter of spending the time to really dig in and figure it out. Whereas most of the time we that's not what we naturally do. We tend to, and this often happens with anything marketing oriented, we often tend to just kind of lean on whatever we learned before, right? And believe, okay, well, this is the way that this is done. This is the way that this goes. So I'm going to do a slightly more interesting version of this, or I'm going to do a faster version of this, or a shorter version, whatever it is. and we don't necessarily take the time to look at something and say, okay, this is the way everybody's been doing it. What is the absolute sort of left turn on that? And how might I start to play around with that, with that idea, with that concept, and just see what happens?
Something you and I spoke about before we started the show, and I want to lean back on memory, but you live in New York, there's a ton of noise. I always use this in a lot of presentations as sort of the visuals you get when you walk through Times Square. There's so much noise with advertising and marketing today. We get hit with so many messages from so many
Yeah.
different angles. Let's dig in a little bit deeper on how you make that product or service or whatever it is that you're selling a little stickier.
Yeah.
There is also the conversation that we've had about differentiation, and so much
Yep.
of what everybody's trying to do that is different. There's just a lot of difference out there
Yeah.
that become normal.
Yeah. So one thing that I think is a really, really interesting opportunity is looking at what I like to refer to as the target problem as opposed to the target market. So a lot of the time we're thinking target market, we're thinking, okay, I'm selling to this group, I'm selling to this audience. And very, very rarely do we think about the idea of a target problem, where we basically say, okay, well, what is the challenge or the issue that the person who is going to buy this product or service is having? And then what is language that I could create or that I could develop that would cause that person to say, oh my God, you just punched me in the chest. And now I need to know how I solve that particular thing. And the thing is, most of the time we describe the problem in a very general way, right? We don't take the time to really think through what is that target problem. And the more specific that we get, we start to attract what I like to refer to as sleeper markets. So the one of the most interesting sort of stories that comes up about this for me is about the show Wicked. Very, very well known Broadway show, right? But one of the things that's very interesting about when Wicked actually came to Broadway, Wicked was on Broadway at a time when pretty much there was nothing for the tween market. You either took your kid to a show, to a musical, and kind of hoped that they liked it, or your kid was aged out of the other things that were on Broadway, the other shows. They weren't really like they weren't really a fit. Or you took your kid to children's theater and hoped that they were willing to kind of sit with the 4 and 5 year olds, even though they were 12 or 13, right? And then Wicked comes along and addresses a massive target problem, which is tweens feel like the biggest outcasts in the world because they haven't developed yet. They're in that place where like their frontal lobes aren't developed. They're feeling awkward and all of a sudden Broadway launches a show that has this awkward, wicked witch character become the hero. Now think about that. That caused Wicked to take off because that market spread that like wildfire. If you were a parent, you took your kid to Wicked, right? So the thing is, Wicked developed that target problem. They really thought through, right? What is this, and for them, they kind of discovered this market, right? They realized, oh, wait a second, we've got a bunch of tweens coming. We should probably keep doing this. But the thing is, anytime we get hyper specific and we create a target problem, there is the opportunity for a sleeper market to basically wake up and start paying attention to us. And most of the time, we don't do that. Like most of the time, we basically have a general problem. We know like this is our market and this is who I'm selling to, and we don't take the time to come up with that. But when we do, it's basically a calling card, right? Where people are like, oh, I need to know more about that. and then everybody's like, why are all these people buying this? I need to know why, why this audience is sort of suddenly, attached themselves to this product or service. And then if we layer on the elements that I was talking about, where we make it really, really easy to share whatever that idea is, whatever that concept is amongst that very rabid sleeper market, well, things are going to take off in a much more significant way.
And you just touched on a point I want to lean back into again, making things more shareable. Talk about the power of really making things more shareable. I often talk about it making it in bite-sized chunks because people want a piece, not the whole pie.
Yeah.
And that at least gets them started.
Yeah.
How does that play as far as the AIM method goes?
Yeah. So basically, it goes back to this idea of influence, right? And that people are sharing things because it makes them look better, right? It makes them look good. And the thing is, if something is not easily shareable and you try to share it and you mess up in sharing it, you look bad as a result of that. So if you've ever seen a TED Talk and it was kind of all over the place, and you go and try to tell your friend about that TED Talk, you're trying to piece everything together. They haven't packaged it in such a way that it's easy to share. So you're like, yeah, and then he talked about this, and then this thing happened, et cetera. And then you're like, I'm not really sure. And you're having a lot of trouble, right? Describing it, breaking it down. Well, now you kind of look like you're fumbling in front of your friend, right? You look like you don't know what you're talking about. So are you going to want to do that again? Are you going to want to go through that experience again of sort of fumbling through and hoping, people get it? No, you're going to go to whatever the easier thing is, right? You're going to go for whatever thing is easily shareable because you can say it quickly, you can break it down quickly for people, and then you look good. You look cool. You look like the person who's sharing the information, not the person who can't remember or understand the information.
So whether you're a business owner, a manager, a marketer, or advertiser, or whatever, what do you think is the most important thing that people can do to start with referability?
Yeah. So I go back to actually my teaching background, and there is a tool in teaching known as the check for understanding. And as a teacher, what you do in a check for understanding is you've presented something to the class and you call on one of your students and you say to that student, so I would like you to tell me what I just said in your own words. And you can see whether or not they get it. You can see whether or not they understand it. So the most powerful thing that you can do is to go to somebody, preferably somebody outside of your circle, preferably somebody outside of your industry, and say to them, I'm going to basically tell you what I do or what I'm about, or I'm going to tell you about this product or this service. And all I want you to do is to tell it back to me in your own words. And you will be shocked at what you think you're saying versus what they hear. And this is the mistake that gets made all the time, is that we don't do enough of that. So if you want to like have like, what is the first thing that basically will just give you a boatload of clarity and help you to start to think about your offer, whatever you have, do that check for understanding. Because it will open your eyes up to the things that you might be dismissing that are actually the things that people are really interested in. It'll open you up to the fact that you are not being as clear as you thought you were. It'll open you up to the fact that there might be a sleeper market that you are not paying attention to. It is a very, very powerful tool.
I could not agree more. I used to give this story all the time. I would talk about, telling somebody a story at the start of a line about, especially about yourself. It could be anything. You can tell whatever basic story it is. Let's just say the word automobile. By the time you get to the end of the line, it gets confused, and now it's rubber baby buggy bumper.
Yeah.
The same thing happens with your own personal message, and it doesn't take a long line of people. It now takes two, and the person that you think you're communicating with, and how off they hear your message versus what it is you think you say. So I love every bit of it. So Michael, I ask this of all my guests. You're on a shark's perspective. What
Yeah.
is your favorite kind of shark and why? If your daughter loves slime, then surely you've got some kind of shark story with kids.
So I actually my favorite movie is Jaws. And it's always been I have always been fascinated with that film, and so The Great White is definitely my favorite as a result of that.
It's a memorable movie for a lot of not good reasons as well, because it is the absolute not way that sharks are. But it
Yeah,
was a fantastic movie from a just a. I mean, it's hard to believe it's 50 years old.
I know, right?
I mean,
Yeah,
what could they have done with the special effects today? So, well,
right.
Michael, it's that special time in the show. Are you ready for the five most interesting and important questions that you're going to be asked today?
I love it.
All
Let's
right.
go.
Number one, you were a high school teacher and you've mentioned movies. So I'm going to bring this up. A better
Mhm.
movie to represent real high school. Say aliens have landed and you only have two DVDs. We're using DVDs, not streaming, to tell the story of high school. The Breakfast
Ooh,
Club or High School Musical?
Breakfast Club.
Yeah, that was kind of a softball. I would have worried, but you had the Broadway roots too. So I was afraid you might say High School Musical, which I think is an
Oh,
abomination on so many levels. Yeah, Breakfast
oh
Club's one of the
man.
greatest. Oh gosh, what was his name? The guy he died a couple of years ago.
John Hughes, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
fantastic movie. So your
so
career
good.
also including being on and off Broadway. So you've got
Yes.
friends in that from out of town. You've only got time for one show. You're taking them to Wicked or Hamilton.
Ooh, I'm gonna say Hamilton.
Really? Okay. Why so?
I'm gonna say Hamilton because Hamilton is just a mind-blowing show. And Wicked has been around forever. Wicked has a film coming out. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's change it then. Wicked
Yeah.
or The Lion King. They've both been
Uh,
around forever.
oh yeah. No, then definitely Wicked.
Okay. There you go.
Definitely
All
Wicked.
right. So you're in Central Harlem. Number three, you're shopping for groceries. Do you like the Whole Foods in Harlem or going to a local bodega?
I I would go with a local bodega. There are a couple of like fun like local places around here that I definitely am a fan of.
That
So
have
yeah.
good fresh fruit?
Yes.
That's
Yes.
that's the hardest thing I always had when I lived there. So, all right, number four, being a teacher or being a producer, a Broadway producer.
I loved being a teacher. I think I will always be a teacher. Like it's just part of who I am. It's just part of the way that the way that I think about things. It Producing is fun. It's an amazing business. I still love and sort of know so many people, but teaching has always been my first love.
So I think most people can think of themselves as being a teacher. They understand the concept. What would have blown our minds about being a Broadway or a show producer that we wouldn't know? Like, because to your point earlier about messaging, the way people on Broadway talk about inside baseball is not the way
Yeah.
everybody coming to the event speaks about it. And I'm always curious a little
Yeah.
bit about how different Broadway is.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that a lot of folks do not know about is how precarious the financial situation actually is. That there are Broadway shows that literally open and close on the same day because of the way that the financials work
Mm-hmm.
in that particular industry. Now it doesn't happen, every day or anything, but there are many instances. There's actually a place called Joe Allen's that has a whole wall of posters of shows that have closed and opened on the same day. So they opened and literally did not have enough money to run and closed that after their opening night.
Yeah, they need a Broadway show called PS 123 or something like that. You need a show about high school in Harlem or Manhattan or somewhere. All right, number
Yeah.
5, and the most important question you're going to be asked today is biscuits or cornbread?
Ooh, it's a really good one too. Oh, I'm gonna go with cornbread. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, Michael, where can people find out more about you, listen to your podcast,
Sure.
keep up with what you're doing, your thought leadership, and more?
Sure. So they can, the podcast is Access to Anyone, and they can just go to accesstoanyonePodcast.com. If they're curious about their own referability, they can go to myreferabilityrater.com, and that's where they can basically take a test and see what their referability sort of scale is, or where they're at. And the website, which will be ready, is going to be referrablebrand.com.
Michael, thank you so much for being with us today on A Shark's Perspective.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
So there was my conversation with Michael Roderick, a former high school English teacher and former Broadway producer, who is now the CEO of Small Pond Enterprises, which helps thoughtful givers become thought leaders by making their brands referable, their messaging memorable, and their ideas unforgettable. Let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from my conversation with him. First, how do we make our products or services referable? Well, to start, Michael's framework can be remembered from the acronym AIM: accessibility, influence, and memory. It's a great metaphor for getting over the hurdles that come up. One of the great points he mentioned is having a well-positioned idea that others want to share and that makes them look cool, all while leveraging less: language, emotion, simplicity, and structure. That whole segment was well worth listening to again. Second, I love simplicity. We've been taught so much about creating complexity over and over again. It seems like all the messages and experiences out there are a tangled mess. But memory rewards simplicity, and I could not agree more with this. It's one of my own favorite topics to point out on stages. Brands and people overcomplicate this too much. There are too many choices out there for consumers, too many are complex, or there's too much friction to buy, and consumers want less of that. I'll put it this way: if Occam made a razor, I'll bet you it'd be more simple to understand and remember than traditional marketing copy from even razor brands, okay? Quite simply, it shouldn't take an English Franciscan friar from the 1300s to point out that the simplest answer is often the answer, and from a marketing standpoint, it's often the easiest one that they'll remember. Third, we talked about target problems and how that applies to differentiation. The more that you're speaking to that individual or group of individuals who have a specific need to fix that particular problem. We often think too much about the packaging and the features and the benefits and all the marketing babble, and not enough about the specific problem that we're trying to solve for them. And the experience that we create in solving that often is the real differentiator. Got a question? Send me an email to kenneth@asharksperspective.com. Thank you again for the privilege of your time, and I'm so thankful to every one of you who listens. I'm not a Broadway star, but off-Broadway, like 1,000 miles south and slightly east of there, where you'll find me in a tropical location. You'll find me doing an underwater show anyway. Please join us on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.